Hey everyone, welcome to Lawyer Up. Today's show, we want to continue the conversation in light of Black Lives Matter movement and what companies are doing or not doing in this time period. We will also cover common misconceptions of what diversity and inclusion means, if there is an intended outcome, and what is all included in diversity and inclusion. We are honored to have two guests that work in this space for today's interview. They both have a strong background in public health and human services, particularly in HIV and health disparities. Are proud co-founders of Intimacy in Color LLC. It's an organizational development and community mobilization consulting firm, which focuses on the wellness of relationships in organizational and community settings. Intimacy in Color uses African-inspired principles and tools, inspiring a vision for a culture of wellness. Their company, Intimacy in Color, provides leadership retreats, strategic planning, and really get hands-on with the leaders themselves, because oftentimes it appears that leaders are not in tune with their workforce. With the times that a lot of corporations are just putting a statement on their website, it's even more important these days to hire consulting companies like Intimacy in Color to step in and give them some kind of different perspective and not just assume things are going well because no one's complaining. And they really take a deep dive into their working environment. Is it really a healthy working environment or not? And what's challenging that? And they really go into also conflict resolution processing. With a Doctorate of Education, a focus of education and leadership change, Dr. Michael Everett is a Director of Capacity Building for ETR Associates. Aunsha Hall-Everett has an MA in Organizational Development and Leadership, serving in the role of Capacity Building Manager for California Prevention Training Center. They both reside in a lovely city of Long Beach, California. Michael and Aunsha are amazing, dope partners in co-parenting and raising their most adorable and intelligent 4-year-old daughter, Monet. So let's hear from our two guests today, Aunsha Hall-Everett and Dr. Michael Everett. Well, Aunsha and Michael, thank you so much for joining us on today's show on Lawyer Up. And, this is not just a show about lawyers, of course, but about talking about actually having a discussion about what's going on recently in the news, legal related, but also movement wise. And I know that both of y'all have been in the space of diversity and inclusion. I know I'm just using that tagline, but please explain to us. Y'all have a company that fits directly into what's going on today. One of y'all explain that?
Mike, you want to take it off?
Yeah, sure. So Intimacy in Color is, it's really a response because Aunsha and I have grown up working in nonprofits, right, in American nonprofits. And a lot of our work is often tied to sort of social justice mission and themes. And for anybody who is involved in nonprofit work, you know that when you are getting money from the government or private funders to carry out objectives and missions, that money comes with strings. So we were super young when we first got into the field, and we were just trying to, make the world a better place, mostly around sexual and social health related issues. And then at some point we realized that the money we got from both CDC and from other places really restricted what we could say and do. And that the organizations we were working on behalf of and, who represented these communities we had fought for had other agendas too, right? Because there are people who run these places that want the world to look a certain kind of way. So if we wanted to have our own voice be heard, we needed to create a platform to be able to do that. And so, we weren't like YouTubers or sort of running to a space to be able to do. We didn't have that capacity yet. So we just said, let's just do workshops because that's what we know. Let's just do them. Let's do them for free and figure it out. And slowly but surely, workshops around race, class, sex, gender, and different kinds of oppressions apply to the workforce, right? Which is a place that Aunsha was growing in terms of his work. And I was certainly growing in terms of training and development for American workforce workers and specifically public health workers. So those things sort of combine, right? So what racist, classist, sexist, homophobic, you name it stuff is sort of governing and how we operate in these places, and then how can we talk about them when it can be a really difficult and uncomfortable conversation to have. So Intimacy in Color was about being people of color and using intimacy, vulnerability as an opportunity for us to discuss really difficult issues that might make certain people uncomfortable, that I think have made white people uncomfortable who had not had those kind of conversations before, and it made public health uncomfortable because they had not been faced with their own stuff in the same way before. So that's what the company did. It was supposed to be a no strings attached opportunity for us to sort of deal with social health issues in America.
And just to follow up with Mike real quick.
Yes.
Hey, hold on one moment.
So I run the risk of the 4-year-old coming down the stairs.
That's okay. I can, if you want, I can edit that out.
Okay.
But
How's that?
we want to make it intimate.
Yes.
Okay. How's
Okay.
that?
All right. Well, sorry, Aunsha, go ahead with your what you were gonna.
No,
lead.
just to piggyback on what Mike was sharing, around those, having those difficult conversations with the end goal, right, of getting through those difficult moments and having those difficult conversations to facilitate this culture of wellness, right? Understanding that in those workspaces, it's usually a space where many people spend a lot of their time. So it's like, how do you begin to facilitate wellness in those spaces for people? And what does that look like? And so having those difficult conversations and being able to do that facilitates some level of awareness for us, right? To know how to best respond when folks are in need and how to use that to best support individuals when those needs do arise. So, yeah.
That's great. Well, I know y'all have been doing very critical and important work for quite a while, but now that there's a movement, right? Do you find that corporations or just even nonprofits are even more open, or is it just all talk, because I've seen a lot of statements on, let's say, Amazon's website, for example, and they say they're behind BLM, but I'm hoping for more, and that's part of the reason for this channel.
So I'll go first and say, I think there are two things that are happening right now. And I think we've also seen this before 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 60 years ago, like we've seen this before in patterns. But the two things that are happening is, one, the performance, which we love, we always get because it makes us feel better. The performance is when companies are responding to some kind of crises, right? Usually out of like race relations, and it's throwing money at the problem. And usually throwing out money for consultants to deal with, because this isn't other people's problem, right? It's about being uncomfortable and wanting to not be uncomfortable and fixing the discomfort as opposed to the issue. So there's the performance element to this. And what comes out of that is usually bias trainings, diversity and inclusion trainings, cultural competency trainings, you name it, they're all really the same thing. They promise to help folks be different. But the reality is that there is nothing that can help you get the education about humanity that your parents have to give to you, right? Like you have to be committed to that, and that becomes a process. So that's one, performance. Two are folks who are looking for a transformational response. And John, I think you were sort of alluding to this, right? The companies seem like they might actually be prepared for some transformation. But I want to remind us that it took us the civil rights movement, it took us everything that's ever happened historically for us to get to a space of transformation. So this is why it's different. Transformation is the willingness to sort of say something, to say something is wrong, to say that power needs to be conceded. It's also about accountability, right? So we're no longer just going to sort of throw money at the issue, but recognize that we need people to be a part of this conversation, and then we need them to be engaged in giving actual supportive, helpful information. But that means we have to let them into spaces they have not been. I've been at organizations and companies where there have been primarily white people, and I've been sort of a token black guy in that space. And I can affect change or let people know what I think other people are experiencing who look like me. But the reality is that you need a diverse perspective, both in blackness, both in brownness, both in sort of everythingness. And so it's not a destination, it's just a journey. So if companies continue to have sort of all white folks operationalize their policies, then you're going to keep getting the same, and that'll be performance. Having to give out money to make the problem go away for 10 more months until the next thing happens. But transformation says that we're actually ready to do something different. And I think that's the hardest thing to accomplish because it's scary. Nobody wants to lose their mansion.
Yeah, and I think then that it means that we have to just be more clear around what is the intent, right? So what is the intent behind all of this? And that's going to get us to what our end goal is supposed to be, or what we envision this to look like. And some of this means like reimagining, maybe even just the entire like structure within organizations or even in nonprofits. Understand that some of these structures may not even have, some of these structures actually, when you look at our structures at this point, or even now, a lot of these structures are like, were not even, when they were created, even meant to be or showing up, in today's America's workforce, women or even like people of color were not even allowed in these workforces, or you had to find ways in there. So even from that standpoint, when folks are coming into these workspaces, they're already operating from, or we're coming from a deficit in a sense. So what does this mean? It's about thinking about how we become more clear around what the intent is and using that to reimagine, right, what this could look like for us to begin to start that transformative process that Mike is speaking of. And so that's going to mean that more meaningful engagement. It's going to be more collective and shared leadership. It's going to mean that we actually understand the power of folks' unique experiences, particularly those of color, Black people, and begin to hear that and receive that, and then use that to best know how do we respond based upon those who we have within our own house, which means our own organization, and how we really making sure that they feel okay, they feel safe, and what the safety looks like for them. But there, I think it will begin to carry out, because now we understand how to take care of home in that regards, and from there we know how to take care of our constituents, our clientele, our communities in which we're seeking to engage.
Now, when you've engaged with, let's just say, certain companies, do the leadership that speak with y'all, do they seem to already have started from the gate some kind of misconception what your company helps with?
Usually, because they don't. So we'll usually get brought in through somebody who is wise enough to recognize that the issue they are dealing with is bigger than what the company can sort of deal with internally.
Sure.
Right? And so, but they need somebody who doesn't have sort of a high profile, where like when sort of talking about the racial class-based stuff that's going on within the company doesn't like draw attention to sort of remove them from being able to be competitive, right, and still be a company that's respected by folks. So I think we become a choice in that regard. With that said, I also feel like that there's something around that we're these two queer men who are Black and have had sort of this experience. And I think that we have a history of having made people feel super comfortable, because that's also been our defense mechanism. So that's also one reason why we get brought into those places, because it's easiest to hear certain things from us that it might be from someone else. So we recognize what all of that might look like. But the reality is that most people don't know why they're bringing us in. They just know they need help. It's kind of like when you need a therapist, you don't know what, you just want the person to come in and start talking to you. Right. And usually it's through a series of conversations before they realize why it's important that it was us as opposed to maybe someone else.
Yeah.
I see. Well, I was thinking it could be a negative, but you really turned it into a positive. So thank you for that. Because, I was thinking that when you mentioned like, oh, just throwing money at the problem. Well, the leaders still don't know what the problem is entirely. So it's good that they can reach out to your company.
And people don't like hearing this, but like the problem is that nobody makes $1 billion earnestly, right? It just really doesn't happen, right? Like you have to support or be in support of the world operating in a certain kind of way to be a millionaire in this country, no matter how good you are. So when you have your competing priorities of like you needing to feed your family, create a legacy, all those things up against the wellness of a group of people or certain people, that can be a real conflict. And so we find that having a series of conversations is the start of change. And that's where I'm invested. I can't worry about changing somebody's mind today, especially a leader who's comfortable and right. And this is the choice for me to be in their space. But if they allow me into the space to have the conversation, I'm going to keep having the conversation until they can see that, fine, once you get that 7 billion, now what? Now are you ready to sort of talk about how life can be different for the rest of the world?
Right, all about timing, right? There's no perfect timing for someone to start that conversation, but time is now, right? At least.
Yes. Yeah.
I remember when someone I know, I think you know who I'm talking about, but they went to their workplace and they had like some kind of diversity meeting or lunch, and there wasn't really a liaison, no one to talk about, have topics. They just say, hey, have go lunch because you're a certain class of people by your skin color. Mm-hmm. And that's just throwing a quick little, I wouldn't even call that a program, but some people think that that's enough.
So yeah, I mean, some folks do think that's enough, and I think this is where what I've appreciated about Intimacy in Color is that we're letting people know that this is a lifelong thing, right? This is a journey, because we all change. The world shows up. Everything's evolved. And so as things continue to evolve, we're always going to see something new, that we're always going to see something that's different. And I think that's the opportunity for us to begin to like step back and say, well, how do we make this a learning opportunity for us, as opposed to looking at, fixated on one thing and seeing how do we just use it as a one-time, like using a Band-Aid or a one-time workshop, right, to be able to do this. I think what Mike has been able to do is introduce this whole thing around critical competency, right, to show that this is something that is a journey, and it allows for us to start becoming more critical thinkers, right, and using how to use and being more like culturally responsive, how to be more, using more cultural humility technique to be able to fully expand on like our critical thinking skills, and using that to better show like, or best show, right, how this is an ongoing thing, and how this further like builds our own capacity of how to show up our best selves in any given situation as things continue to change. I'll let Mike speak more on critical competency if he would like to.
Well, I mean, even like I was thinking, even before critical competency, right? There's sort of two things that sort of stand out here for me, and one is that asking folks to concede their power for companies that they built, or communities that they feel like that they control, like that is going to be a challenge no matter what, no matter who you are, and it's a real challenge. So the thing is that when we think about white supremacy, is that a lot of that gets reinforced and institutionalized by the threat of having to concede power, right? If I feel like I'm going to have to concede that, then I'm going to do what I need to do to kind of keep myself in a position where I get to decide what happens or doesn't happen. So that's sort of just the first place. But I think that for me, this is a conversation too about what anti-Blackness is, and it's so much more than just color, obviously, especially in this country. But the reality is that we have to be willing to evaluate what we've learned about Blackness and our anti-Blackness and our relationship with anti-Blackness from Walt Disney to the White House, right? From what we're seeing on cartoons and movies to the policies that are sort of coming out. All of those things sort of matter in between. So what I do love about this opportunity, because America's always had these issues. They've always been racist. This is not new stuff, right? What I love is that the opportunity to create change happens from an ecological perspective. So we have these opportunities to us, our company, to go in and sort of just talk about what we learn, what language we learn that sort of promotes sort of racialized experiences or discomfort for people, and what policies do that, but also in between, how do family structures and communities do that? How does the lack of access to economics do that? All those things are about ultimately conceding power, but I think once people see that this group can't get ahead until we're all having the same conversation, that we'll get there. But we got to keep having the conversation, and that's what's most important for me, is that this is a movement and it's not just a moment.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You mentioned policies and with certain companies, and I think that's the critical part, right? The infrastructure. How has a company been set up to make, like you said, the billion dollars, but to make those changes there, because it's not just the social media and everything is like calling people out, the Karens, for example, but it's not really just the individual, right? Because that would take a long time. You have to start with also the company structure. Mm-hmm. Kind of like what people are talking about, defund the police, things like that.
So can I start off, Aunsha, and then you can?
Yeah, go ahead.
So as soon as you said that, like what came up in me is that it's about diversity and inclusion, which I know is sort of the key trigger word. We're going to say this till we're all tired of hearing it. But here's what's important about diversity and inclusion, that it's missing an aspect. You can have diversity without inclusion. We know this, right? But you cannot have inclusion without diversity. And what's good is it's important to have different people at the table. That's why we want diversity in the first place. But what good is it to have all of these different people at the table if all the food is still white, right? So that's one example of what that could look like. Mm-hmm. And some people are not going to eat that, or can't, right? Or culturally, for whatever. So having diversity is about the different kinds of people having access. Having inclusion is about their ability to sort of be inside the space and contribute in some way, right? But there's another piece that's missing, and that's belongingness. And that has to be a policy that we create. And the belongingness is that we create these companies that we have people grow up into, but culturally they're never themselves inside of. I think about it's just weird sort of little things, right? So culturally for me, it's like, we've been working at home, and I didn't have a haircut, and different people are different ways about not having a haircut. But when I don't get one, I start to look like a werewolf, right? And so it's a very different experience for people to see me without a haircut than with one. And most people don't see me without one. So for me, I struggled with, like, do I wear a do-rag, or can I wear a baseball cap or something? Because certain people can get away with that. And some people don't even understand what plight that I might be talking about. But I recognize that that is something that I struggle with. As minute and ridiculous as it sounds, it was a big issue for me, right, to decide that I was going to wear this hat or do this my way and be unapologetic about it. So if you multiply that by all the millions of micro experiences you're having that are about your race and your culture and your perception, your age, your sexuality, all those things, it makes life difficult for people. So diversity is important, is the first step. Inclusion, right, is creating that process. But belongingness is what gives me ownership of your company. And I think what's important to remember is that we said like Juneteenth and Kwanzaa, those are events I want to celebrate in my life as a Black man, but never felt like I could do that in the companies and structures that I work for. So the question is, how do we get from, but meanwhile, I'm forced to celebrate sort of holidays that don't represent my ethnicity, right? But they've been prioritized. So those are the little ways that I can tell that anti-Blackness still exists inside those companies and corporations. And those are also ways that we can change that. We can give people permission to celebrate their lives and their legacies and their histories. All of that stuff is important. So I'll leave it there and let Aunsha.
And just to, and piggyback on Mike, I always just think, as he was sharing it, made me think of two things. That one thing that I always lead with whenever I'm going into these, and going to any organization, is around like, how do we begin to honor the souls that are assuming the roles, right? And understand that these roles have very like meaningful contributions, right, to the organizations in which they're working for or that they're serving. I wouldn't say serve, I'll just say that they're collaborating with or working with. And so in doing that, what it does is begin to look at those particular things that Mike made mention of. So what are some of those microaggressions that we're not addressing for people who are color or folks who are Black or folks who are brown or, anyone who's experiencing any level of oppression, right, in today's society. But also I think about, what do we do to begin to create like a structure, right, that allows for that, where people can bring themselves to work and feel okay with bringing their whole selves to work and feel safe enough to do that. I understand that we have to begin to also remove ourselves from saying safe space, because that should already be there. So I want to say, I guess, in words of Brene Brown, well, brave spaces, right? That allow people to feel brave enough to just show up in those spaces and be their best selves. So there's one particular org structure I think about, or org model, that's really becoming quite new to many folks, and I'm beginning to see people begin to introduce this, and it's called holacracy. And so holacracy is a great way of beginning to honor those souls that are assuming those roles. And so it does numerous things. It taps into folks' strengths. It taps into folks' unique expertise. And also it taps even into folks' lived experiences, right? Understand that even influences how we show up and what we bring to the workspace as well. And even in the way in which the structure where meetings are had, where we look at addressing those particular like microaggressions or things that even happen to us outside the workspace that still can still carry over into the workspace, but allow for us to be able to support one another to have those conversations. And then we get into those specific tasks. So what it does, again, as I'm going to continue to say, is honor the souls that are assuming the roles, which begins to facilitate a sense of belonging for folks, because now they understand that you are looking at me not just on what I can do for you, but you're looking at me for what I actually can do for myself and to the greater world or to better society. So this is something for many organizations and corporations to start thinking about as they think about diversity and inclusion. It's like, how do we, again, as Mike said, bring that sense of belonging, but what org structures can help facilitate that to where people feel brave enough to want to continue to go along with that?
No, that's great. Y'all have us a greater perspective, or like a holistic perspective to share with different companies and individuals. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you.
I just had an interview with talking about survivors, and we're kind of thinking we're talking about the children. Do y'all have opportunities, or let me rephrase it. Do you find that there are valued opportunities where you can either speak to children or maybe even teachers? Because, someone that's 40 years old already has all these ingrained experiences, let's say from their parents, right? So their surroundings. So I wonder if, because, I was a board member of a charter school, and we had something similar to talking about diversity and inclusion. But
it sounds like then you already know then how important it is sort of to talk about and educate young people, because that's where the most change is possible, right? And so we both have worked in high schools, and we both have done, like, the first half of our career was about young people exclusively, and a lot of what we built up and created for adults were the workshops we were doing with young people, because they were hungry for that kind of information, right? They didn't understand why things were the way that they were, or how to look at things through that sort of that lens. It was only until, you know, I started pushing 40 that that my commitment to adults sort of became renewed, right? But I saw a way in, which was, if we are able to change, and this is really about 35, I would say, we're able to change institutions, then we can change adults, because they're more likely to follow policy than they are just to follow good information. So we became focused on how to break down policies within organizations. How can they sort of reevaluate them and revamp them to make them different? But a lot of our work still, like, if people call us to do work with young people, that is our preferred space too, because, like I said, what they do with the information, instead of where they're able to spit back to us and give us a whole other perspective, is oftentimes more helpful than sort of fighting folks who have kind of set in their ways and stodgy about having to change because they're comfortable.
That's great. Yeah, because I was just talking with someone else earlier that children are like sponges, even at our kiddo's age, 22 months, and she just mimics our mood and our tone. It's very amazing to see.
And scary.
Yeah, it is. It is. And we're homeschooling as well, you know, on top of working, right? So there's homeschooling. I mean, she's 4, so she was already in a child care center. But now we're taking on that responsibility, especially getting her ready for kindergarten. I think we've done a great job with that. But, you know, it's outside for the diversity and inclusion. But again, we're thinking about coping techniques for her. So when those moments of her getting frustrated during her learning development, of how to, like, bring it down and just do calming techniques. So, I do. We're beginning to see more value, right? And, well, even though, as Mike made mention about that renewedness and working with adults, and that we're finding, but we still have that passion and love for still working with, like, young people. I think being parents now, and we're seeing the need to continue doing that. So I know Mike is always thinking of various curricula that could support, right, development of young people. Those from 3 on up. But yeah.
And our kid she's no exemption, right? Like, it's like, I feel bad for her sometimes, because I think the heavy stuff that she has to learn early on, because she will be a Black woman, right? That we have to sort of give to her to prepare her for this world. It feels heavy for us. I'm sure it feels heavy for us, but heavy for her. But it's a part of it's a part of the larger conversation. And I can't be frustrated with other people not giving their kids opportunities to understand race, class, and sex differently, if I'm not doing it for my own. So I recognize it really starts right when she starts absorbing everything, right? And so it was one little example where I think this Christmas, they were getting everybody, the kids, which are primarily Latino and Black, to go see a white Santa, which I just thought was interesting. I'm like, you know, y'all looked for this Santa, y'all couldn't just find. And so there's a Black Santa in downtown LA, you know, for everybody to go see. He's been there for years, been a staple. And like, y'all don't just go make a trip to that Santa. So when I told her about it, you know, I told her Black Santa. So that's what she's been calling, Black Santa, Black Santa. So it's an interesting thing to have to be aware, but also to walk that line where I'm not giving her the bitterness too, right? Because that's part of what I have to work out in my own therapy, that I'm giving her the information that empowers her, and not like the frustration that we wear on our shoulders from just carrying this stuff our whole lives.
And can I just say something, Mike? You brought up something around, you know, the amount of work we have to do with her, right? And let her know what's ahead of her. And I think those are things that have to be brought up, right, in organizations, right, when we're thinking about diversity and inclusion, right? In thinking about, I thought something that Mayor Keisha Bottom, who's, you know, the mayor of Atlanta, I saw this panel on CNN of like 5 Black mayors, right, in major or metropolitan cities. And so Mayor Keisha Bottom was one. And she made mention about, you know, having to work, you know, twice as hard as her white peers or white counterparts. And it's true, like, we've been taught to do that. And I think that has to be brought up in conversations when we think about diversity and inclusion. What does privilege look like? How are we using that privilege, right? Are we using that privilege to support, help, leverage others' ability to be able to, like, for upward mobility for them, or are we using it to create harm for them? And so, as Mike talked about in regards to shared power, sometimes people are afraid of that because they feel they're gonna have to give something up. But we have to understand the privilege. People have to understand and be more aware around their privilege and how they're using that. And I think there's beauty in the story that Monet may have to tell around her own development of her father telling her you have to work twice as hard and what that was for her. I'm hoping she doesn't have to, but she may have to, and hopefully that story is what helps facilitate more change in a workplace setting so people can best get that, hey, many marginalized folks, or folks shouldn't have to be marginalized, but that they are, and this is what they're experiencing, and this is what we begin to see play out even in the workspace, and we have to change that.
Well, y'all are being put to the test right now with your own daughter.
Yeah.
For sure.
So, so we're excited. We're excited for what y'all have to accomplish because y'all have been in the works for quite a while now. But with that being said, with your experience, Aunsha, you talked about the intended outcome. Have you found through your experience so far that companies are just wanting it to be solved tomorrow, but right, these are like institutional policies, company policies that you have to gradually change, just like defund the police movement, that it will take some time, right? Go ahead.
Yeah, it's so weird. I was just in a conversation this past Friday with an organization, and Mike, I'll let you, because I know you have probably seen some great intended outcomes. Or maybe some process outcomes at this moment. But there was one in this organization, and they made mention so in light of George Floyd and what happened, we finally had, the organization finally had the conversation, and then, here it is now, August, and not much movement has happened. So during this time, we're having the conversation, and the question has been asked, like, well, what movement are we trying to do? Which was me asking the intent. And they thought that just maybe having that one-time meeting of bringing folks together would just be solvable enough. And it's not, right? It doesn't get us to the outcome. There are many people, or there's still Black and brown folks in the workspace who still feel uncomfortable, who don't feel brave enough to share what they're experiencing. And so for me, I see that there is an intent there, but there's just not the capacity or the know-how, right, to take this off. And I think there's also and I think this is also driven by fear. There's a fear and a discomfort to know how to be able to do that. So I do think that people want to get to this juicy and intended outcome. I think there's just still that level of fear. There's a discomfort. There's that the lack of know-how and getting folks there. But I do know that there are some companies that have started that process. And I think Mike can speak to that.
Yes. So, I mean, even with, I guess I also want to say that, like, in terms of starting that process, that many folks are in the struggle zone. And that's when you're asking yourself questions you either haven't asked before or you haven't gotten an answer to yet. And I think those are important questions. Now, if you're just doing it in isolation, it'll go away because your brain will figure out how to compartmentalize these things and do what you need to do to survive until this dies down. So we can keep this out of the moment space and into the movement space. Those conversations that individuals are having inside need to happen in groups, in small groups and teams within their company. And that includes the leadership team and projects need to have that company. I think need to have that conversation. And I also think that if organizations are designed to do a service for the community, then you need an internal thing happening and an external thing happening. So that sort of brings me to 2 points. One is that for any change to happen in terms of behavior, whether it's the behavior of a company or a behavior of an individual, there are 3 things that will always be critical. One, that there is knowledge or a new understanding of knowledge, right? So language to be able to deal with, to talk about it, to discuss it, and to figure it out and plan together. Then there has to be sort of an attitude thing, right? If your attitude around it is that I don't give an F or I don't care for this thing, then you're not going to, that knowledge is not going to be helpful for you, right? You can deny things like climate science, right? You can deny those things if your attitude wants you to do that. The other part is skills. So if you have the knowledge, and even if you have an attitude, but you have no skills toward changing the problem, organizing, getting other people, like being able to listen, reflect, like all of those skills that help communication, then behavior change can't happen without those 3 things sort of being in place. Even the simplest of interventions recognizes that, and any intervention will have some part where you're getting new knowledge, you're having your attitude adjusted, right? And then you're also giving skills to match, and then you're giving an opportunity to test that and launch it. So I am grateful to work full-time on top of Intimacy and Color with the company ETR Associates that does education, training, and research. We pride ourselves on coming up with a science-based public health idea that can go from concept to scale within our door. So that's great that we can all do that internally. We're a big, massive distributed company who now, for the first time, is everybody's working from home. And so we're creating new policies around that. We're governed by a Black woman in leadership, even though most of the organization is primarily white. So that's a new turn for the organization. And then there are more Black people in it than there have been in the last 30 years, right? So that's also a turn for the organization. So those were things that were happening before this anyway. What this opportunity is allowing us to do now is to think about, well, what are the internal things that have to happen? I just finished school. I just got my doctorate degree. So, I'm waiting to do some transition work. Thank you. I'm waiting to do some transition work within my job. So transition my role and figuring out what that looks like. Once you get a doctorate degree at my job, you have to be responsible for a project you're passionate about. It's not about carrying out somebody else's mission. And I wasn't sure what that was going to be. But when this happened, it became clear that the company, which has been historically white, needed Blackness, needed checks and balances around the work we did with Black people, for Black people, and by Black people. And so they allowed me to build that out. So that was one of the first things they allowed me to do, was create a concept that they're putting into practice now that helps us to look at when work is happening with Black folks around science or research, and if things are unethical or need to be different. And then the other part is that they're allowing me to throw out what are community mobilization models that help Black communities become stronger in the face of this too. So their relationships with police, with the government, with health department, how do I help support what Black work is happening there? So for me, that's going to be a process, right? That's like another 10, 15-year commitment or whatever. But that is the kind of change that I see as helpful and as useful and as possible for right now. Otherwise, we're just still having the conversation and trying to understand. So outcomes are hard because mostly it's about money.
But as we at Intimacy in Color, right, as we continue to work with, organizations and nonprofits, we begin to see a need of using this appreciative inquiry process, right? And it's a 5D process that kind of walks organizations and corporations through, but it also allows for them to facilitate a level of it lowers their defenses, right? Because you are having those difficult conversations. But in the midst of having those difficult conversations, what we're doing is 5 things, right? What we're doing is first defining what the problem is and what's happening within the organization, right? And that could be a difficult moment in defining that. But to get us through that, right, we're beginning to discover like what is actually working within organizations that facilitates, folks to feel brave, or folks to feel safe, or folks to feel comfortable and feel like they're bringing their whole selves in work. And then the next piece is for us to begin to dream, right? So begin to dream about what it is that we want and what are those intended outcomes that we so desire, right? And also begin to dream, as Mike looked at those internal and external allies or partners, right? Begin to dream about who are we working with that we not, but need to be working with. From there, begin to develop some level key strategies, right? And based on the dream of what we're discovering and what works, and using those strategies, developing those strategies that are, specific, that are measurable, that are attainable, relevant to what's happening, and also within a specific time bound. And then from there, once we see one that we can see that we can move forward with within a reasonable time frame, or that we feel very actionable for us in that moment, we begin to look at, well, what can we do to kind of get us to that destiny phase, right? And begin to set us to doing that. So in using the 5D process, or that appreciative inquiry process with organizations that we are working with, again, allows them to feel safe, we can have these difficult conversations, allows them to begin to tap into the strengths, the expertise, the unique experiences of those who are within their organizations that have not realized, and those unique talents that they bring, that they have, that we didn't know that they bring. So doing some level of strength finders in that as well, but also being able to do some level of like Johari window, right? Begin to see what we know about the organization that is working, what we don't know about the organization that others within the communities see that is working or that is not working, what we all don't see that is working, and what we probably just is unknown, just based upon external factors. And we can see within this political climate, a lot is changing, right? Even just the global climate with COVID, how this came on, this pandemic changed, and now we're going into this new norm. So all of this, what we're doing is in the midst of having these different conversations with organizations, as we look at diversity and inclusion, is us thinking about us reimagining what a workforce of that facilitates a culture of accountability, a culture of wellness for us. So that was just moving this forward and having those different conversations. One way to facilitate that is just use of appreciative inquiry. Again, for us to define the problem, discover what is working, and and the talents of those who we do have, and the talents of those who we do know of, and begin to use that, dream of what could be, and all that good stuff, and begin to develop some strategies, right? Some actionable next steps, those that are smart, which means specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and within a specific time bound. So we'll know what it is that we're doing and how we're moving forward. And within those objectives that we're setting, right? Look at some actionable next steps. And which ones of those that can really allow us to move forward in a way that facilitate the meaningful change in which we envision. So again, we're beginning to use a lot of that appreciative inquiry process, right, to work with organizations just to, again, create that meaningful change in a way that invites all people, right, and it celebrates the diversity and the diversity of just thoughts, diversity of background experiences and unique experiences and expertise that folks bring.
So with that in mind, Anshe and Michael, I think of back to intended outcomes because you mentioned timeline. And I'm just going to assume that a good amount of leaders don't know what that timeline looks like because as leaders, they just want to see results tomorrow, right? So is there a way that you're able to explain that, okay, this kind of conversation to break it down and to facilitate change, it could take, X number of months.
Oh, yeah.
Everyone's committed, right? They got to pledge and actually commit to it.
Yeah, and it's okay not to know the time because there shouldn't be a time set around this, right? This is an ongoing thing and things are going to change and that good stuff. I think what we could do, right, is just begin to set timeline around those actionable next steps, right? So as opposed to being in the space of, oh, we would like to do this or putting out that statement, right, in which we begin to see a lot of companies do, put out the statement. Mm-hmm. But follow that up with some actionable next steps. And those can be small next steps. For instance, Mike threw out a few around those work groups. Those can be actionable next steps, right? That can let folks know that we're actually doing the work to facilitate the meaningful change or the change in which we desire. I was thinking about a learning community, right? Having that learning community that invites the internal folks, your external folks you're serving, partners, or whoever that may be, but bring those all folks to the table or to a space. Let's not even say the table, just to a space. Even thinking about the structure, the infrastructure of an organization, how in which we currently exist, or even some of the policies, procedures, or protocols. Begin to look at that and begin to say, hey, as part of that learning community or that learning group, as part of this work group, what can we do, right? To begin to look into what we currently have internally and how is that, right? Maybe re-triggering or also like still showing, some of the racist belief, racist philosophies, or some of the things that can further marginalize people in the workspace. Let's begin to look at that and see what can we do that can change that. Also, another thing is how we can also have just maybe weekly discussions, right? Just to be able to check in and see how people are doing. I think that many of us sometimes in the workspace or just every day, we'll ask, hey, what's up? How are you? But do we really mean, how are you? And it's important to take that time out to ask, like to be ready to hear how people are doing, because it can influence what goes on in the workspace. It's going to influence productivity. It's going to influence customer service. So for us to be able to take time to ask that question, make space for that to be had, for people to share and feel brave enough to share that, all those things are reasonable, actionable next steps that we can create a timeline around. This is when we plan to implement those things. And as a result, we can come back quarterly, right, to check in and see, or even during monthly staff meetings, whenever those meetings had, to see what small changes are happening. Small changes lead to huge successes. So we can begin to use that to measure the small changes and how that's leading to our intended or desired outcomes that we set forth.
Well, with that being said, I'm going to, in the description box below, I'm going to add intimacy and color information, your contact information of your company, because I think both of y'all will be able to provide a lot of value for different corporations or, companies, nonprofits that, if a company has a lot of departmental heads, leaders, but you have the, chief of diversity inclusion, for example, that one person, even if that person has the knowledge, may not necessarily share that with all the department heads. So I know that both of y'all would be able to help out with that.
And last not least, when we think about diversity and inclusion, we also need to think about pay equity, right? And not just, and that just means within gender, within race and ethnicity. Think about that and how that even influences, the workspace and us like, and how that can even distract us from getting to the intended outcome. I think about me as a Black man, right? And sometimes I see that some of my white counterparts get paid more than me, but I'm struggling here and I'm still expecting to show up my best and I still bring sometimes twice as much, right? And so it's about thinking about even just pay equity or the inequities and what can we do to even change that, right? So how do we begin again, once again, honor the souls that are assuming the role. And sometimes it means paying people what they actually worth or what their talents are showing and how that's actually leveraging organizations. And sometimes that comes from folks who are not white. You know, it comes from folks who are not men. It comes from other folks who are marginalized and who are experience a lot of oppression, even in the workspace. So it's about what can we do to level that playing field as well. And that may mean deconstructing the current org system to be able to make that happen.
That's a great point, because I think it was last year or 2 years ago, they talked about pay and equity for the females. Yeah. But I don't recall having talk about race or color, POC, for example. So thank you for raising that.
There is data that's out there that does show, I know, for instance, like in public health and healthcare, there's data that shows that there are Black and brown healthcare workers who are paid less and also who are not in leadership or supervisory roles as well. So again, it facilitates this lack of inequity, but also a lack of safety for many people in the workspace when that does happen. How can one bring their whole self to work if that's what they're experiencing and they have those barriers as they're coming into the space?
Well, hopefully you'll have an opportunity to collaborate with different HR departments, or I know there's different vendors that help provide data on pay scale, right? So
yeah. Hopefully
that's an opportunity there for y'all. Well, Mike, I don't know if you want to add to what Aunsha was saying, or we can, I could like to ask for your parting thoughts.
Yeah, that works.
I talk too much, Mike. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No. All these things are large concepts, and so like trying to make sure you can get the communication across is a challenge, right? Yeah. And so for me, in terms of closing thoughts, if people walk away with anything, or companies or whoever sort of watching, on the sort of three things that sort of stand out for me. One is that that many cities and counties have moved toward, a couple have moved toward declaring racism a public health crisis, right? And that is a large scale testament to how big the issue is, right?
I agree.
And I like that happens, because whether or not individuals agree, it don't matter. The science has said that it's a problem, and so we need to move forward. So the first step is that have your organization, have your company, have your city, have everybody do this so that it can get on the list of priorities. So that's one. The second thing is getting some trauma-informed language. If you remember earlier, I talked a little bit about having language, because knowledge is one of the ways that we do behavior change. But if you're not trauma-informed, if you're not clear about how the historical perspective of trauma impacts how we show up today, whether it's that do-rag conversation I have, whether it's the anti-Blackness conversations that I was talking about before, or the ways of being. And I'm not talking about being racist, because this is much more complex than just being racist, right? This is about what's embedded inside of you, the way that you operate that you don't even realize. So whether you own a company or you work for a company, we're all in this together, and we all have change we need to make, including Black folks who perpetuate a lot of this stuff too, particularly Black folks who also run companies, which I know can be a whole other show that we can talk about. And then the last thing is to be sort of asset-based. And John, you brought this up already when you said the positive perspective. Well, that's all I have. Everything else is trauma and downtrodden, right? So I need to think about, what can I do? How can I change things? How can I make a positive impact? And so that's about looking at the assets, what's possible. I know that privilege is oftentimes about, is a way that people use to sort of get through their life and experience and to come up, but not everybody gets access to privilege, but people can have protections. People have risk, so they can have protections. And what companies can do is build in protections for folks, have folks go to school, think about how people use time and spend their day at work. What is wellness like at work? All those little things matter. So for me, focus on promoting what you can and not about getting rid of racism, because that's not any one person's job, that's everybody's job. But what can you do to promote the wellness you want for your organization? That small step can make a huge difference for someone like me.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, that's really a good point. Let's just do what we can, and then collectively, hopefully it would make a collective change.
I agree.
Yeah.
Well said, Dr. E.
That's right. Thank you, Dr. Everett. Well,
I'm
we,
with-
like you said, we could have another show about this topic, and break it down to subtopics. But thank you so much, and I hope we can ask y'all to come back on in the spring. And good luck raising your 4-year-old.
Anytime.
And good luck with what you are doing great with Chloe. I love the video.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for having us as well. Thank you, John.
Yes, thank you so much. Appreciate this opportunity.